Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 69 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1 in the overtime. This was the Sharks' third matchup against Edmonton this season. In their first one, the Sharks were at home and got absolutely embarrassed by the Oilers by a score of 3-0. It might not look as much on the scoreboard, but I can definitely guarantee you that the Sharks were not even in the same league as the Oilers on that particular night. In the second matchup, it was a very slight improvement, but still the Sharks got relatively embarrassed in that second game against the Oilers by losing it 5-2. Here tonight, while the Sharks would of course still end up coming up with a loss, though of course there was that extra point from the overtime loss, it was definitely a vast improvement from the first two matchups against the Oilers, and I would go so far as to say that the Sharks were indeed the better team here tonight. And if you were to play out this matchup with this type of result 100 times, I suspect the Sharks would actually win the majority of those times. Just unfortunately, at least for the Sharks themselves, that they end up losing this game. They will obviously be disappointed with the result, though considering the fact that the Sharks are not in the playoff race at this point with 13 more games to go after this one, the fact that the Sharks are still playing close games, exciting games, and then still coming out on the losing side despite the 1 point is probably the best possible thing for the Sharks. They get to still play meaningful games, or at least games that they're giving meaning to, and they're still, keeping it close and not getting embarrassed and packing it in and things like that, but they're still trying to keep their standing spot low enough that they can get a high pick in the upcoming draft. On to this particular game. In the first period, it was Tomas Hertl getting the power play goal to put the Sharks up 1-0, but the major issue for the San Jose Sharks and why they ended up losing such a winnable game was that after that one goal from Tomas Hertl, while they did generate other chances in this game, Mike Smith was very strong in goal for the Oilers, and the Sharks just couldn't seem to solve a way of beating him besides that Hertl goal, and so they never really built upon this 1-0 lead, and eventually a series of mistakes on the power play for the Sharks would lead to a shorthanded goal for Nugent Hopkins in the third period to tie the game up at 1. And once again, with that tie game, the Sharks did have another couple of chances to try and get the lead back in this one, in particular in the last couple of minutes of the third period, where the Sharks had a couple of great opportunities, but no dice there. And then heading into the overtime, even with Leon Draisaitl out of the lineup for the Oilers here tonight, you're going to end up struggling a bit, and we saw why. A nice little play from Mike Smith to not freeze the puck and instead keep it alive. He plays it forward for McDavid, who activates his speed hack and decides to just zoom past Brent Burns and easily beat, well, I shouldn't necessarily say easily, but he ends up beating James Reimer on that breakaway to get the Oilers the victory 2-1 in the overtime. So it was kind of a missed opportunity here for the Sharks, but probably a good thing that it ended up being a missed opportunity in the grand scheme of things, even if in the moment, especially for the Sharks players, it's going to sting. On to the players to talk about. We have the first line, which was once again quite effective here tonight. Hertl did have the goal, though it came on the power play, so not necessarily a general line type of domination, but they did have a ton of great chances. This was the line that was really doing it. Barabanov had one of those great chances in the last couple of minutes. Meyer had one of those great chances in the last couple of minutes, and just generally it was a line that was doing a lot of very good things here tonight, which was good to see, but also not necessarily all that surprising. I've already mentioned this line multiple times in my past few reviews. They just continue to click. It's honestly not even that worth talking about at this point because it's just kind of assumed. A line that it is worth talking about is actually the Sharks' second line, which featured Couture, Chmelevski, and Noah Gregor here tonight. And surprisingly enough, I would say, especially in a game where Couture did find himself matched up a decent amount of times versus the best player in the world, Connor McDavid, Couture actually had an extremely effective game. Couture looked one of his better games in a while. Chmelevski has been improving after the first couple of somewhat shaky games in the lineups. His past couple have been very impressive, and he made a couple of nice plays here tonight, and Gregor was also rolling very, very well to manufacture a very serviceable second line. It's obviously not something that's going to be super consistent unless Chmelevski really pans out to be a very strong player for the San Jose Sharks, which, no offense to him, I guess I kind of doubt, but it was definitely effective enough here tonight. They obviously didn't score a goal, but that wasn't for a lack of chances. They controlled the puck mostly when they were on the ice compared to having to defend, which is a good thing for a line that features not necessarily Couture, but the weak spots of the wingers when it comes to that defensive side. And so I was rather impressed, and we may finally find a second line that features Couture and his two wingers that could potentially stick from one game to the next. Obviously, it was Dahlin stepping out of the lineup here tonight, and which allowed for this second line to come form. I suspect with a couple of the potential injuries that we did see here tonight, which I will get to a bit later, Dahlin will come back, but I suspect not immediately on this second line. When it comes to the third line, we had Leonard, Bonino, and Nieto, and I didn't think that this line was necessarily too bad here tonight. Nothing super amazing, but Bonino had a couple of very good chances for himself. I thought Leonard, prior to his injury, which I believe occurred near the beginning of the second period, actually had a couple of decent shifts. Nothing amazingly impressive, not like Sasha Shemelevsky on that second line, but Leonard definitely had a couple of decent looks. And then Nieto was also okay. Generally, when you kind of look at the rankings of this game, you have the first line, then you have the second line, then you have the third line, and then of course we have the Sharks' fourth line for the game here tonight. Balcers ends up on that fourth line. Not too much of a surprise with how he has played as of late with Reedy and Gadjevich, and this fourth line kind of looked a bit lost here tonight. Gadjevich was also a player who ended up blocking a shot similar to Leonard and leaving the game with an injury. His occurred more later on in the third period, so nothing hugely, the Sharks didn't have to go with 10 forwards for too long. But this fourth line just didn't really have a lot going for it. I thought Balcers looked pretty good, especially when he started moving up in the lineup near the end of the game. Had a couple of decent shifts there, but when he was with these two players, Reedy and Gadjevich, it was just not cohesive. Nothing was going right. They were having issues defending in their own zone, and generally it was a very, very weak fourth line for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to the defensive pairings, Burns and Magna once again leading the way, surprisingly have been very, very solid for the San Jose Sharks. Like I mentioned earlier when it came to Couture having that great game, even though he faced off a lot against Connor McDavid, Brent Burns is also extremely similar in that regard. Burns found himself with the matchup with McDavid for a while and actually did a decent enough job. Obviously, McDavid is going to get chances. That's going to happen whether you're against, a random 6th, 7th defenseman on the Arizona Coyotes or you're Roman Josi or Cale Makar. He's going to get chances because he is the best player in the world, but Brent Burns did a good enough job of neutralizing him that he actually didn't get a point at even strength and only ended up getting that one in the overtime. You could technically say that after Brent Burns takes this shot onto Mike Smith, he should be retreating a bit more to try and keep up with McDavid just in case Mike Smith does keep that puck alive. So potentially a small misplay there, but even I wasn't expecting Mike Smith to actually keep that puck in play, so somewhat surprising. But otherwise, Burns very solid defensively, and also need to note of Jacob Magna. Usually when it comes to the player playing with Brent Burns, they usually do get a lot of credit for when there is that solid defensive play. I remember when Joachim Ryan joined Brent Burns a few years ago, Ryan was given a lot of credit for that top pairing actually doing well. The same goes with Paul Martin, same goes with Radim Shemek, same goes with Ferraro at the very least at the beginning of last year, and so the credit does have to go to Jacob Magna. It is not easy to tame Brent Burns, but Magna seems to have found a little bit of that over these past few games, and it's nice to see that the Sharks' first pairing is finally acting like a first pairing, because for most of this season that hasn't really been the case. When it comes to the second pairing of Karlsson and Ferraro, still some kinks to work out between these two players. Ferraro and Burns had been playing together for so long, and while it didn't really work near the end of their journey together, I guess you could say, certainly they had built up some pretty solid chemistry, but suddenly now Ferraro is with Karlsson, and they've never played together pretty much, so there are going to be some growing pains there. Karlsson once again had a game where he had a couple of nice offensive looks, certainly, but also a couple of poor reads. There was this one particular play where he gave it away to Evander Kane in the defensive zone, and a couple of other somewhat sketchy moves, I would say, but generally, like it is for most of the players on the team besides maybe the fourth line, it was a positive experience, I would say, for Erik Karlsson. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, this was where we saw yet another substitution. Milosh comes out of the lineup, not really that much of a surprise, like I said in the previous review, and Merkley steps in, and Ryan Merkley had what can only be described as a Ryan Merkley game. You see, Merkley is a very high event player, to say the least, and while he has had some games that have been extremely positive this season, and some games that have been extremely negative this season, more often than not, we are going to get games like we saw here tonight from Merkley. Like I said, a high event player. Now, what is a high event player? A high event player is a player who's going to do a lot of good things for you, but he's also going to stand out in a somewhat negative way as well. Very similar to the two other high event defensemen that the Sharks have, both Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson. You see, compared to, let's say, Miloš, who is, of course, a low event player, Miloš is not going to stick out in a super positive way, but not going to stick out in a super negative way. His mistakes will usually be taking an icing at a bad time, maybe screening his own goaltender a bit too much, taking a shot from the point and missing it, and then it kind of just leaves the play dead. It's things that you'd really have to be paying attention to actually notice in terms of mistakes. But on the positive side, Miloš isn't necessarily going to add a ton to your team either. He's not going to be making a ton of offensive moves. He's not going to be making that fantastic first pass out of the defensive zone. He's not really going to be making a lot of things happen. That's what makes him a low event player. But back to Merkley, his high events, the negative side of that is going to be where he goes for some sort of diving play and ends up missing a pass, which is something that we saw on this shorthanded goal from Nugent Hopkins. He's going to have those bad giveaways, which again is something that we saw. He was in his own defensive zone under absolutely zero pressure, and then after a few seconds just ends up going for a pass, giving it right away to Fogel, who then just walks right around him and getting a good shot on net. But we're also going to see the positives of the high event play. He's going to walk players near the offensive zone blue line and get a good opportunity. He's going to get a nice shot through, which is going to allow for a nice chance on net because of some potential sticks in lanes. And so generally, this is the up and down play that we're going to see from Ryan Merkley. If the Sharks were going towards the playoffs, I could definitely see the argument for why you might want to keep Miloš in the lineup, because you're already icing two extremely high event players with both Karlsson and Brent Burns, and you might not want a third one. However, since we're going down the stretch in a season in which the Sharks are not going to be making the playoffs, I see zero reason why you should be playing Miloš over Ryan Merkley. Merkley has a much brighter future, no offense to Miloš, and definitely needs more of that development time to build that confidence. And so here tonight, it's kind of what we should be expecting from Ryan Merkley, and I feel like it's a bit unfair to bench him in this particular situation just because of the general feel of this season thus far. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they would take on the Calgary Flames, who they have actually had a good amount of success against this season compared to their Alberta neighbor, the Edmonton Oilers, who the Sharks played tonight. The Sharks are actually undefeated, if I'm not mistaken, against Calgary this season, and we'll see if that can continue. Class dismissed.